everybody. My name is Sara. I'll be speaking about algorithmic collusion by large language models. This is joint work with Yannai, Gonczarowski, and Shorrer. So some of you might have seen this before. This happened in 2011. And what happened was there were two sellers selling the same product, and one was pricing it 0.99 times the competitor, and the other was pricing it 1.27 times the competitor. So as a result, the price for this normal book blew up really quickly in the millions because there was no oversight here. So since then, algorithmic pricing has become much more prevalent and also much more sophisticated. This can be beneficial to the consumer, but also it raises concerns of algorithmic collusion. And throughout this talk, when I talk about collusion, what I mean is pricing above Nash levels. And when I say algorithmic collusion, that sort of lies on a spectrum. So in the simplest case, so one way to break it down, which was done by Klein in this great article, is you can talk about how feasible and enforceable the form of collusion is. So on the one end of the spectrum, you have explicit algorithmic collusion. This is, you can think of a normal cartel, they just happen to write code to implement their cartel plan, basically. On the other far end of the spectrum, we have autonomous algorithmic collusion. This refers to independent self-learning agents that collude despite no explicit instruction to do so. And the interesting thing about autonomous algorithmic collusion is that it's not a priori clear whether it's even feasible or how to enforce it if it does indeed arise. And because of these thorny questions about autonomous algorithmic collusion, it's not obvious whether it's even possible. There's rich literature that is focused on further studying this phenomenon. And in particular, there's a lot of papers that show that it is indeed possible. And I've highlighted 3 on the screen here. The first 2 are looking at autonomous algorithmic collusion pricing settings, and the third is looking at bidding settings. And what all 3 have in common is that the underlying learning algorithm they use is Q-learning, a form of reinforcement learning. And in all 3 cases, they build bidding or pricing agents, and they show that autonomous algorithmic collusion rises. However, Q-learning specifically suffers from certain barriers that make it difficult to implement in practice. For one, it requires a very long training period. So for example, in the Cavano paper, they need hundreds of thousands of periods to converge. And moreover, Q-learning has been shown to be exploitable by certain adversaries. However, just because Q-learning specifically may not be practical doesn't mean that autonomous algorithmic collusion is not a concern more generally. And specifically, you might imagine using LLMs instead of Q-learning is the core of your pricing or bidding algorithm. Because LLMs sidestep these concerns. For example, they're quite robust, and also they're already pre-trained, so that you can do a lot with in-context learning. And in fact, some of you might have seen this went viral earlier this year. LLMs are arguably already being used by sellers in various pricing and bidding settings. For example, here we have LLM-generated product titles with very little oversight, possibly no oversight. And so it stands to reason that if sellers are using LLMs for this, maybe they'll also use them for pricing as well. And so this is the core question of our talk. Are LLMs going to give rise to more feasible autonomous algorithmic collusion? To study this question, we conduct experiments on LLM-based pricing agents and study the following questions. So first, we're interested in understanding are LLMs even advanced enough to do pricing in the first place? To do this, we test them in a simple monopoly environment. Second, we move to a duopoly setting. We look at if multiple firms are simultaneously pricing using off-the-shelf LLMs in good faith with no intention to collude, may they still collude anyway? And then finally, we want to understand why this is happening. And to do this, we look at the effect that the LLM's prompt has on the collusive outcomes. Any questions before I move into this? So talk about our model now. This is the economic environment in which we'll be running all the experiments. We have N firms. Each firm sets their price from the market, and they're selling a differentiated copy of the same product. The quantity sold is going to be given by this formula here. The thing to keep in mind is if your product has higher quality, you sell more. And if your price is lower, you also sell more. And it's a logic demand model, which means that things taper off continuously. So if I undercut all of you, then I don't get all the market share. I get like some, and then I get more as I make my price lower and lower. Profit earned is exactly what you expect. And this is the model taken exactly from the seminal Cavano paper. This is our overall experimental setup. So what we're doing is we're having LLM agents setting prices in this economic environment. Specifically, whenever we do an experimental run, it has 300 periods. And what this diagram is doing here is it's zooming in on one period. So there's two boxes that are going on. So first, there's LLM call box. This is where the prices are actually being set. So what's happening here is it takes its input, what I'll call plan and insight, so I'll explain that in a second. and market history, and then it outputs a new price that it sets. So specifically, the market history, this is the previous 100 periods of pricing history, 100 due to context window limitations. And what this consists of is the prices set by all firms, and then also that specific firm's quantity sold and profit earned, the data from the last 100 periods. Then we also have these things called planned and insights. So this is LLM generated text. And basically the way it works is when the LLM sets a price, it writes about its plans for the future, and then those future plans get sent to the next period of the LLM. So they start out empty, and then after one call, then there's going to be planned and insights for thereon after. Any questions about the architecture? Great. Okay, so now we're going to zoom in on this LLM callbox to understand how exactly the LLM goes from like being given this huge data dump to actually setting a price. So the LLM call, the LLM sets a price using a single query that looks like this. So at the top of the prompt is the prompt prefix. This is just some text that tells it it's trying to maximize profit. It's doing a pricing task. By the way, if you've heard of chain of thought prompting, this is essentially a very long chain of thought prompt. Second, we give it basic information. So we tell it, for example, the cost. Third, we give it the market history, as I explained before. So this is just this data dump of all the prices and then its own quantity sold and profit earned. Fourth, we give it some instructions on plan and insights. So we tell it what types of things it should be writing there, and then we also tell it the previous plans and insights. And finally, we have the output instructions to make sure that it actually gives plans and insights for the next round. So one of the things we really want to understand is this treatment of how does changing the prompt affect the pricing behavior. And to do this, we vary this first thing here, prompt prefix. All the other aspects of the prompt are going to stay completely the same throughout all experiments. The reason why we vary at the top of the prompt in particular comes from the LLM literature. People have shown that LLMs put the most weight on the very start of the prompt. So this is how we're going to get the strongest effect size. And so specifically, this is our boilerplate prompt prefix, I guess you could call it. We call it P0. It just says your task is to set prices. Your top priority is to set prices that maximize profit. And then on top of this, we have two treatments, P1 and P2, each of which consists of P0 with stop added on. So P1, we just sort of reiterate the importance of maximizing profit, whereas with P2, we tell it to be risky, we tell it to do undercutting, and we want to measure whether there's any difference in behavior between these two prompt prefixes. Yeah.
So the LLMs communicate only by the prices, or can they share information other than that?
Correct. They only communicate by the prices. They can't talk to each other. If they did, there would be a hard time for collusion. So you see in the diagram here, it's just, the prices. That would be interesting to see what happens. Any other questions?
You just get one period from the, you just know the plan from the previous period or the history of plans?
We only know the plans from the previous period. Otherwise, we would quickly run into context window limitations. But we do notice if we inspect, they sort of repeat what they said. So maybe they say, oh, I'm going to try this strategy for the last 5 periods. They'll sort of incorporate that. And they use similar structure. And so it's sort of, we get continuity in that way.
Are they told that the competitors' prices are also being set by an identical prompt?
That's a great question. No, we don't tell them anything about the competitor. In fact, we try and have the prompts not really reference how many competitors there are or what's happening. We're sort of telling them they're acting against an environment over which they have very little control. Great. Okay, I'll move on. So these were, by the way, this is the main treatment. So we have 2 different prompt prefixes, and that's what we're going to be looking at. Okay. So the first question we wanted to address is, are LLMs even advanced enough in the first place to set prices? To do this, we run this monopoly experiment. So we have a single LLM agent in a monopoly environment setting prices. Because there's no adversary, it's completely, it's deterministic in the sense that there's a unique profit maximizing monopoly price. The question is just finding this correct price. And the LLM has query access to the environment. It doesn't know the underlying demand function. So we try a whole suite of LLMs. Here are 4 depicted, but we also tried many more. And basically we see that modern LLMs, such as GPT-4, can correctly do this task, whereas older LLMs, such as GPT-3.5, cannot. And the 2 pricing graphs sort of illustrate this. In each graph, we see the price plotted as a function of the round over time. The green dotted line corresponds to the monopoly price that maximizes profits. GPT-4 finds it eventually and sticks with it, whereas GPT-3.5 is just sort of all over the place. Interestingly, also, GPT-4 Turbo and subsequent LLMs do not actually do this task successfully. So if you're trying to replicate us, that's why. Next, we move to the duopoly experiment. So this is our main result. And here we're trying to understand whether multiple LLM agents, if they play with each other, whether they collude. And so to do this, we have 2 LLM agents with the same prompt in the economic environment. Each dot in the left scatter plot corresponds to experiments. We have 42 experiments, 21 P1 versus P1, 21 P2 versus P2. And so in the left scatter plot, we're plotting the prices of the two firms. The red dotted line corresponds to Nash, the green dotted line corresponds to monopoly. And we see that in almost all instances, we get collusion because we have super Nash pricing levels. Moreover, we see that P1 is much more collusive than P2. It's pricing significantly higher than P2. And in fact, if you look at the right plot, this is showing the profits. The green, okay, so the axes are shifted, by the way, on the right plot, so pay attention when you look at that. The vertical axis is the sum of the profits, and the horizontal axis is the difference. So that green dotted line at the top is representing the total profits a monopolist would earn if it controlled both agents. And so the fact that there's so many blue dots right up near that green line is indicating that P1 is earning near maximal monopolist profits. Yeah, okay, so in addition to our main duopoly experiment, we also run several robustness checks. We see whether they still collude when the demand environment is stochastic. The way we measure this is we vary the attractiveness of the outside option. We also run the experiment with asymmetric qualities, and we also run the experiment P1 versus P2, or also LLM agents versus non-LLM agents. And in all cases, we still find that collusion persists. Especially relevant to this workshop is, of course, auctions. So we also study LLM bidding agents in an auction environment. Specifically, we look at a repeated first price auction for a single item in which both bidders value the item at the same amount. This is following the third paper that I listed on the first slide, where they show that autonomous algorithmic collusion arises with Q-learning-based bidding agents. And here the two treatments are these A1 and A2, where these are, again, two prompt prefixes. And so A1 talks about how lower bids result in lower payments if you win, whereas A2 talks about higher bids cause you to win the auction more. And yeah, so we see on the right-hand side, I'm plotting the average bids after 300 periods of pricing. The red dotted line corresponds to the valuations. This is like essentially also where Nash lies. What we see here is that A1 is colluding. It's bidding significantly below Nash and below value, whereas A2 is bidding near equilibrium. And I find this particularly striking because both all these LLM agents, they have access to the market history, which means they should be able to infer that what they're playing is a first price auction. And the two things in these prompts, these are just two facts about first price auctions that the LLMs, they should be able to figure out. And so the fact that just reminding them of facts that should be common knowledge causes such drastic differences in behavior, that's really striking to me. Okay, so finally, we've gone over how LLM-based pricing agents collude. I have, what, like 5 minutes or something?
Yes.
So now I want to talk about why does this collusion arise? And this is tricky to answer completely, of course, because interpretability of large language models is an open question beyond the scope of this talk, but we do study this in two different ways. So first, we just look at the pricing data that we get, and we look for features associated with reward and punishment. This is because tacit collusion, one way to sustain it is using a reward punishment scheme. So specifically, we look at stickiness and responsiveness, more on this in a minute. And secondly, we also, now that we are using LLMs, they also write so much more than just the prices they set. They also write explanations and text about what exactly they're doing and why. And so we analyze this text to see any associations between the prompt and the text and then the resulting pricing behavior. So I'll walk through both of these quickly. First, the analysis of the pricing data. So we want to understand stickiness and responsiveness. And to do so, we run a fixed effect linear regression. So what we do here is we're predicting my price from my previous price and the competitor's previous price in all of our duopoly experiments for both P1 and P2. And here also a detail is that we splice, we're only predicting odd periods from even periods so that we don't have any overlapping data points. Here are the results. So the self coefficient corresponds to stickiness, how much I anchor on myself. The competitor coefficient corresponds to responsiveness, so how much I'm anchoring on the competitor. And we see that for P1, the coefficients are larger than for P2. And this indicates in some way that they're stickier and more responsive. And this is consistent with our observations also that the P1 prompt was more collusive. Finally, we'll get to the text analysis. So we also analyze the plans written by the LLM to try and understand how do these relate to the ultimate pricing behavior of the models. And specifically, we do an experiment flow that looks something like this. So we start with plans written by the LLM. The 2 columns here on this slide are 2 example plans. So usually the LLM, like all of you probably use ChatGPT, you know how ChatGPT likes to write lists. So it does that here too. It writes this list of plans. And then what we do is we take these, we split them into sentences, and then we embed them using an off-the-shelf embedding. And then we do PCA, and then we finally cluster them. So we have these embedded vectors, we cluster into 20 clusters. And then for each cluster, we look back and we keep track of how many of the vectors came from P1 versus P2. And in this way, we can sort of understand, is this cluster more P1-y or P2-y? And then here's the results for that. So on the left-hand side, I have 20 text rows. These are each descriptions of clusters generated by an LLM that sees some samples from the cluster. And the bars are indicating the relative prevalence of the 2 prompts, so P1 versus P2. So for example, the uppermost is the most P1-y cluster in a sense. It's talking about maintaining pricing. And at the very bottom, we have continue undercutting competitors' price. This is apparently the most P2-y cluster. And we see, and yeah, so here we're able to isolate some differences between P1 and P2, essentially. And yeah, this is also consistent with what we've observed because P1 was the more collusive prompt and P2 was the less collusive prompt. It sort of makes sense that a less collusive prompt, maybe it's undercutting more or something. It's hard to know. But yeah, and also what's really notable is that none of these cluster labels are talking about collusion at all. So it's definitely not the case that the LLMs are saying, I'm going to try and collude with my competitor. Somehow something more complicated is happening to get to the results that we're seeing. Yeah, that's all I have to say. Happy to take more questions. Yeah.
Have you tried the mixed treatment between P1 and P2? There's only one exploring leads to less collusive behavior in both.
Can you repeat the question?
Have you tried the mixed treatment? Like one is P1, one is P2?
Yeah, we've tried running P1 versus P2, yeah. And yeah, it's interesting. They still collude. Here, let me go back to, the plot is right here. That's very convenient. So you sort of see P1 price is higher, P2 price is lower. P1 versus P2 is kind of in the middle. And specifically, it's this weird, not equilibrium, I should say. It's this weird outcome where P1 continues to price higher than P2, but they're still colluding somehow. It's as if P1's quality is higher or something.
I have another question.
Oh, yeah.
So is there any like P1 and P2 goes to 2 different levels of exploration? Do you have any way to interpolate or like do a continuous like amount of exploration? Is there any, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So you're pointing out that they have different rates of exploration and it would be interesting to explore this space in between, sort of.
Yeah, is there
yeah.
any continuous space of prompts that you can?
Yeah, I mean, so there, my answer to that would be budget, right? So there's only so many, like this is a huge high dimensional space. We can only explore so many prompts. I wouldn't say, by the way, I wouldn't say our effects are solely due to exploration because of our auction results. There we have, the prompts are exactly the same in terms of how much we tell it to explore. Like because you're pointing out that for P2, we tell it to be more aggressive and to explore more, whereas P1 we don't. For A1 and A2 though, we use the same treatment about aggressiveness and exploration, but still we get the differences in collusion. So, well, first of all, I agree. It's interesting to vary the exploration rates, but like these effects aren't solely attributed to that. Happy to talk more offline also, since
Thank you,
about that. Yeah.